This is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
And we had this crazy idea. Let's brew something that hasn't been brewed in, a few thousand years, right?
Right.
And the idea behind this is to give you a tasting of something that's ancient paired with something that's modern. So you have two glasses in front of you, and we're going to pour first the ancient one, and then we'll come through and we'll pour the modern one. And Paul and I will be talking as we go through this and giving some history behind each of these. And then we'll finish the discussion with each of the types of beers or wines with then a description of the modern. So if you want to do comparison, when you get your ancient, take a sip of it, wait for the modern, compare the two. If you don't like them, there's also a glass on the table that you can just dump them into.
Dump bucket.
Right? Dump bucket. We're not offended. In fact, there were a few brews that we did 2-3 times before we weren't offended. So the other thing is, this isn't a formal sanction thing, right? If you have to use the loo, you know where the loo is. If you want more food, please get up and get some more food. If you have questions, we'd love to give answers. So we welcome those. Am I missing any? Oh, I saw several people had dressed up, and we really appreciate that. I'll start with my costume. This is ancient 1950s bowling shirt, black socks, blue shoes. Paul?
I'm sort of going for a nomadic horse warrior from the 13th century. It's kind of a combination of a Mongolian robe with a Turkish hat and then these are just moccasins, so they don't really match. But I thought they looked appropriate. So some kind of nomadic horse warrior, but nothing exactly specific.
Well done.
Yeah. And are we ready to start?
Let's start. Hold it.
I have a little somewhat audio-visual presentation to go on in the background. Let me see if I can get it going. Second. You don't have to actually really pay attention to it. It's sort of just in the background there in case you want to watch.
I'll just walk through.
Glad you got you guys on it.
Yeah, well, they got my mom. No.
So, how long has fermentation been going on?
Oh, forever.
Yeah, a really long time. So, the first fruits evolved during the Cretaceous era. And so what would happen was these fruits would fall off the tree, land on the ground, and start to rot. What is rotting? Well, mold or yeast would get on them. They'd convert the sugars into alcohol, and basically that was it. The fruits just stayed there on the ground for tens of millions of years because ethanol is poisonous. It's toxic. Can't be eaten. But something very interesting happened. Somewhere between 20 and 7 million years ago, a group of primates developed the ability to metabolize alcohol. So why was this important? Well,
They were from Ireland.
Could be. No, this actually opened up a whole new food source that, no other animals could take advantage of. And fortunately, we humans are descended from them, so we inherited that gene to metabolize alcohol, unlike most animals, like dogs. You can't give a dog alcohol because it will, you shouldn't really do that, but yeah, don't do that. But if you want to see funny videos, go on YouTube and type in drunk monkeys, the drunk monkeys eating the rotten fruit off the ground. It's really funny. And so that's basically where alcohol was for a long time. During our caveman days, they'd pick up fruit off the ground and eat it, a little bit fermented. And also honey, right? So, so imagine like a comb up on a tree, and it drips onto like a rock, like a flat little rock. And over time, the honey would start to ferment. And our Uncle Thug, caveman Uncle Thug, would come with his big reed straw, and he'd suck it up, and he'd get a little alcohol buzz and a little bit of energy. But they found out that if you mixed water with the honey, it would ferment better, and you'd have a little bit more to share. It was probably the women who figured it out. Probably not Uncle Thug. But the first direct evidence of people intentionally fermenting alcohol into some type of beverage comes from China 9,000 years ago. And they know this from like chemical residue on pottery shards. And what they were fermenting was a combination of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruits. Not sure what that tasted like, something between sake and mead, maybe? I don't know. But within 500 years, they were fermenting wine in the Caucasus region. And by 3500 BC, they were brewing beer in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So think about that. The first brews were being brewed 9,000 years ago. But bread wasn't being made for another 2,000 years. So, the agricultural revolution. Why were they doing it? Maybe because they wanted beer? We don't know. Maybe. It's possible. Beer could have been the catalyst for the agricultural revolution. It's an argument to be made. But we also know that in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, workers were paid in beer. So 5,000 years ago, the pyramids were built, and the workers, 20,000 of them, were paid at the end of the day, every day, 2 gallons of beer. Doesn't sound too bad. Wow. But the thing is how do you keep track of all of that? Who's getting the beer? How much beer needs to be made? How much grain is being collected? Those are a lot of figures for someone to keep in their mind. So what do? Yeah, write it down. So, could it be another argument that beer was the creation of writing? Maybe? I don't know. It's an argument. I like to think so. Yeah, so...
Was the creation of the whole accounting, business.
Yeah, because the first writing system in cuneiform is, records, receipts, inventory. I mean, they're not talking great stories. It was all like inventory. So that was it. So basically, each region of the world, depends where they were doing some type of brewing. Every single culture we've come across has some tradition of brewing. In ancient Mesopotamia, they had grain, wheat, and barley available, so that's what they were fermenting. But in Mongolia, they didn't have fruit or grain. So what did they do? They fermented horse milk into alcohol. Yeah, so if there was a way to be fermented, they found a way. So every region of the world has some form of alcohol, and it just depended on what the ecology was and what kind of fruits or grains or what was available. And so we're going to take you on a little tour of the ancient world through alcohol, and I will turn this over to Rick for our first brew.
Well, actually, Paul, you said how long ago?
China was 9,000 years ago.
Have you seen the recent study on the Natufians? Recent. Natufians, right? So there was a study from 2018 that came out of research from Jordan and Palestine that showed the Natufians were brewing beer 13,000 years ago.
Wow.
Can you guess what they were brewing it for? Well, besides to get drunk. Ceremony. I heard over here. What else?
Livestock.
Ceremony. Religious, right? Weddings, right? These are things that are mark pivotal dates in a person's life, right? Yeah. So let's start very near the Natufians. Let's start in Babylonia. Unlike Paul, I have my notes. So we're going to go back. The Sumerians developed writing somewhere around 3200 BC, right? 3200 BC. That's 5,200 years ago. That's 50 generations ago, if you want to put it in human lives. That's a long time ago. It's from the Babylonians that we understand, because of the writing, that they were brewing beer in 2000 BCE. 4,000... What?
24 years.
24,014 years ago, give or take a decade, right? So the Babylonian Empire was centered around the city of Babylon in Mesopotamia in what is now modern-day Iraq. What was that empire like? What do you think?
Dry.
Dry?
Bad for women.
Ain't different. The comment was bad for women, and it hasn't changed much.
Oh, I thought you said faster women.
So, Babylonia was a whole set of unified city-states that was ruled by a number of successive kings. And the most famous of these states is Babylon, right? What do we know about Babylon?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Very good. What else do we know about Babylon?
Had gardens.
Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world, right? Remember, this is 4,024 or so years ago, right?
They were a fruit basket because they perfected irrigation.
Yes. They had irrigation, right? And it was all irrigation without pumps, all gravity fed. That's awesome. So the Greeks got over there, and the Greeks actually were enamored with the Babylonians. But not so much the Bible. They were disparaged in the Bible, right? The most famous king, Hammurabi. And what did Hammurabi do?
He brewed beer.
He did not brew beer. He wrote a law. He actually came up with the first comprehensive legal codes, right? Is that true? I read it in like 3 different places, and I'm like, oh, that's Corey.
Famously, yeah.
Yep.
That's true.
Awesome. So it is true. When he died, the empire quickly fell apart. However, they didn't stop producing beer. So what do we know about the production of beer out of that era, right? So this is the first written word. So proto-cuneiform documents dating back, can you imagine trying to read the papyrus from that era? They had invented notation for barley production, rations of barley, portions and allotments for workers, and regulations for payment and beer consumption. Lists. Long, long, long lists of who's getting the barley, who's malting the barley, who's brewing the barley, and how's it getting distributed. And they were regularly brewing this at production 1,000 years, probably before we know of the writing, right? Because you think about it. If you already have an established system where you know how much is being made, how much grain is coming in, and how it's being allotted, you got to have that well established. So, beer production, in its simplest form, and if you were here when Paul and I gave the whiskey tasting, we gave a very brief on this, but it can be summarized as the decomposition of starches by means of enzymes produced through malting grains. So you malt the grain, roast it a little bit, you then add water and you add yeast, and that breaks down into alcohol. The yeast or bacteria is really critical because that's where the alcohol production is made from. Originally, it wasn't with yeast. We were doing it with bacteria, right? Think about that fruit that fell on the ground. Nobody's coming around and adding yeast to it. My great aunt Bet, with the mead and keeping Uncle Thug fortified. Nope. That was yeast and bacteria coming into it. So the Babylonians, with all of this practice that they have, they started doing something really interesting. Instead of brewing beer from malted barley, they brewed it from a combination of malt and bread. The bread they called Bapir, B-A-P-P-I-R. And we had some Bapir with our soup tonight, and that was what was broken up into it. Tablets from the archives of the city of Gursu, right, show that there are 5 grain products and Bapir for the production of brewing beer. So what they actually came up with is Bapir's beer bread. It's a coarsely ground, twice-baked barley bread. The making of Bapir includes first malting the barley, grinding it, same as we do with wheat, right? Combining that with flour, the barley flour, water, and yeast, And then the dough is baked until the outside is brown. Pull it out of the oven, let it cool, slice it into logs, throw it back in the oven, bake it again a second time. What's that sound like? Biscotti. So we've been making biscotti for a long time too, right? Yeah. And then the Babylonians, as they're making their beer, they're throwing in malt and they're throwing in this bapir. So you get this really interesting fermentation going on. They call that fermentation manu. That sounds really familiar to Hawaiian mana. I wonder, there's got to be connections, right? So that Guinness slogan, a sandwich in every bottle, is predated by some 3,000 plus years from the Babylonians, who interpreted it as bread is beer and beer is bread. Exactly. So we got our beer recipe from Harim Hauso. He's a Swedish Assyrian writer from Stockholm. He's been working on a cookbook of ancient Babylonian dishes, and he was kind enough to share this beer recipe with us.
And you didn't invite him?
We did, well, long ways to come, but yeah. He says that this beer was inspired from a hymn to the beer goddess. What was that? They had a goddess of beer. And her name is Ninkasi. So this first recipe was written down 4,000 years ago. Take a taste. Tell me what you think. What's the first things you're picking up on it?
I got a lot of fruit, like dates or something.
Very good. A little bit sour. Yeah. But not lemon sour. Right? So here's how Paul and I made this beer. We first made Bapir. It actually took twice. So we made Bapir twice. And then we combined it with Manu to create for you this ancient Babylonian beer. To make the beer, we also added water, yeast, date syrup, because we needed a sugar, and spices. Did anybody taste? What'd you taste? Dates? You get the dates? What do you taste for spice? Cloves is a good answer. Cinnamon is a good answer. Cardamom? Yeah? Nice.
So what spices were in there?
Cardamom, and fennel, and
That was it.
that was it. Yeah, cardamom and fennel.
Yep. So all of the beers in this ancient beers, right? They're low alcohol content. To increase the alcohol so that it actually comes up to a level that we will appreciate, we added the dates. There are recipes from this same period that shows the date being added to this. And it's both a sweetener, and you can add honey or dates. And then the second thing that we did is we carbonated it, because how many people like flat beer? Yeah, that's what I thought. So if you're not into beer, you might like flat beer. And if you're into Belgian beers, you might like flat beer, but nobody else likes a flat beer. So we carbonated it. Okay.
Which originally, if you're going right off a fresh vat, probably was lightly carbonated.
Just from the fermentation.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay. To do the modern equivalent for this, right? We brewed a farmhouse ale. But we did this for two reasons. One is we brewed the farmhouse because it's very low, typically in hops, right? There's not a lot of the flavor from hops. That way it's paired equally with the Bapir. And it's typically spiced. So despite farmhouse ales being one of my favorite styles of beers, it's very difficult to get them in Hawaii. can't get it here, so Paul and I are like, well, we're brewing all of these ancient beers. We may as well make a farmhouse beer too. So we brewed up a farmhouse beer. For this, we went through the rustic ales. So we went back to what would have been produced in this area of the Kingdom of Flanders. Today, that region encompasses northern half of Belgium and the bordering areas along France and the Netherlands. Farmhouse ales typically have low alcohol. Let me caveat that. If you're brewing in the winter, it has low alcohol because you brew it and drink it. But if you're brewing it in the summer, you have to actually store it when it's really hot out, so they would bring up the alcohol content so that it would stay stable across the hot summer months. So what we drink from a Belgian ale is the summer style. This is the winter style. Ours came in at about 3.5 to 4% ABVs, and it's made for immediate consumption. What do you think? Pretty good to consume. What characteristics are you getting?
I'm getting an apricotish banana.
Yep. Banana? Straight off the nose, banana. Malt. You can smell the malt. You can taste some of the malt in it, even though it's a thin beer. Yeah? Any sweetness?
Yeah. And it's the banana apricot. It's got a big fruit thing going on.
Fig, banana. Any tang?
A little bit, not much. Not as much as I would think.
No.
I actually
We knew
like
Rick
it.
was going to be here, so we kept the sour to a minimum. What do you think? How does it compare to the Bapir?
I like this better.
I like it, but
It's this.
You like Bapir?
This is more like modern beer.
This is modern beer. Yep.
You like the ancient one over there?
Yeah. So how many hands up? Ancient beer?
We're the first. You like the first one.
I didn't dislike it.
Prefer, what you prefer.
Yeah, prefer. How many prefer the modern beer? Oh. How many are agnostic? Because that wasn't a full vote.
I want the corn.
All right. So that wraps up our Mesopotamia and Babylonia. Paul's going to take us to South America. Nice.
Okay, guys, so now we're going across the ocean to the Americas. So when most people think of great civilizations in the Americas, what do you think of? The Inca, the Aztec, the Maya, maybe even like the great nations of the north, like the Cherokee, the Iroquois, the Sioux, things like that. But those were the civilizations which were around when the Spaniards first arrived in the 16th century.
The Olmecs.
Yeah, exactly. There have been civilizations in the Americas 4,000 years before the Spaniards ever arrived. Now, when did the first peoples come to the Americas? We're actually not sure, but the earliest evidence at the moment comes from Brazil. There were 3 pendants carved from giant sloth bone, and they date back to 25,000 years ago. So people have been in the Americas for a long time. But the first great civilization of the Americas began in 3500 BC, right here on the coast of Peru, and it was called the Norte Chinca. Now, just to clarify, this is not the Incas. The Incas wouldn't exist for 3,000 years. Different language, different culture, totally different culture. So 3,000 years ago. And so they started here on the coast of Peru, and do you know what crop it was that, I don't know, was like the catalyst for their civilization? Can anyone guess?
Maize.
Maize? It's a good guess. Anyone else? Potatoes? It's another good guess. Huh? Rice? Maize, yes. You would think that's another good one. But it was actually cotton, which was the foundation for this. And you're thinking, cotton? How would that start of civilization? Well, Peru has some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, but it wasn't until the domestication of cotton they were able to make fishing nets large enough and strong enough to catch enough fish to have a surplus of food. So if you want to have a city of thousands of people, you need to have a surplus of food. Until cotton was developed, it just wasn't possible. So the Norte Chinca was an interesting civilization in that they built pyramids just like all the great civilizations of that time around the world, but there were no defensive walls around their cities. Not one. They can't find any defensive walls, no artistic depictions of great warriors or battles like, if you go to the Assyrian civilization. So some scholars believe that they actually had no concept of warfare at the time. Another interesting thing is, unlike every other civilization, they had no pottery. Pottery wouldn't exist for 1,500 years after their civilization began. Very unusual. They also developed probably the most unique writing system in the world. It was called quipas. And how would I explain? So basically imagine a long rope with a bunch of tassels hanging off it, and they tied different knots along the tassels, and that's how they were able to communicate. We've interpreted the writing system, but apparently, like the counting system, we know how they counted, but apparently you could tell stories, you could negotiate trade deals, but unfortunately that knowledge has been lost, so all the quipas that survive, we mostly don't know what they say at this point.
So is that a how many knots you can tie a minute type of a thing?
Maybe. But yeah, so the Norte Chinca was the first civilization of the Americas, and around 1500 BC, new crops came up like quinoa, sweet potatoes, lima beans, and llamas were domesticated, and so the civilizations moved up into the highlands, and that's when we get our first evidence of chicha being brewed. And by this time they actually had pottery, so we have the evidence from the pottery. So what is chicha? Chicha is corn beer. So corn comes from a grass from Mexico called teosinte. And originally this grass was pretty much inedible. The kernels were way too hard to eat, but they mostly used the husks for baskets and sleeping mats and things like that. But over thousands of years of selective breeding, they turned this simple grass into what we think of as an ear of corn. And by 2200 BC, it had spread all throughout the Americas, north and south, and became the most important crop of the Americas. And let's see what else. So, how is chicha made? Well, chicha is extremely simple. You take corn, grind it up, add it to water, boiling water, and add yeast. But what was interesting was they hadn't developed the malting process like in Babylonia. So what they used to get the starches into sugars was called amylase enzyme. Now, do you know how you use amylase enzyme?
Chop up sugar.
Spit it up and spit it out.
Yep, you chew it up and you spit it out. So they grind the corn into a meal, they chew, and then spit it into a pot of boiling water.
Guess the tune.
Yep, and that's before the malting process, that's how they would do it. And so it was pretty much,
Who's had their corned beer? Who took a sip already? You daring people? Who chewed on my beer?
Is that why it smells like socks?
well, it was an interesting process. So we went through a couple of iterations before we got it right.
Yeah, we got.
But so the brewing process, it was mostly drunk for religious ceremonies, like every other place, festivals, religious ceremonies. But it was also drunk when the season was right by the common people because, well, drinking a beer after a hard day of work, it feels good. And it was the women who did the brewing. Now, I know what you're thinking. The women were in the kitchen anyway, so they just made them do this on top of all their other chores, right? Actually, no, not at all, really. So the Incas, the kingdom of the Incas, would send out representatives to all the villages in the mountains, and they were looking for something called alacuna, which means the chosen women. And so, I don't know why they called them women, they were 10 years old. So they find these 10-year-old girls they thought were extra special, they'd bring them to a school in the central town or city, and they trained them for 4 years in all sorts of things. So it was textile weaving, religious ceremonies, but in brewing, they were trained. And when you graduated from this school, they returned to their villages, and a dedicated brewery would be built that they would run to give chicha to all of their, to all the villagers. And because they had graduated from the school, they had their pick of high status men in the village. And the creme de la creme of this school, the valedictorians, top of their class, they could stay in the capital, and eventually they could marry like either a nobleman or someone within the royal family, become a high priestess. So becoming a alacuna and a brewer was actually a good step up in society at this point. And chicha was drunk all the way from 900 BC all the way until the Aztec times. Oh, sorry, not Aztec, sorry, Incas. Yeah. And so for our brew, this one took us about 3 attempts to get right. So the first time, we decided to use malted corn. And we had malted corn and a little bit of Colombian brown sugar just to get the alcohol up, and some Peruvian peppercorns just to give it some spice. And the beer came out bright pink, like Barbie pink. But the taste was really unpleasant. It was foul. It was astringent, almost like something you'd rub on a cut. It was quite unpleasant. So we tossed that. We dumped it. So we tried again. And the second attempt, we decided to use sprouted corn instead of malted corn. And the taste was much better this time, but the smell was very earthy, kind of like socks, a little bit.
I didn't like it.
Corey hated it, so we threw it away. So we decided to go back to basics and say, why reinvent the wheel? These guys figured it out. Let's do it the right way. And so Rick and I, we didn't chew it. You can actually buy powdered amylase now. And so we ground up Peruvian black corn, and we added a little bit of sugar and the spice, and we put the amylase powder in, and we had our corn beer. And it came out to be around 4.5% alcohol. But yeah, it's a pure corn beer. And what are you guys tasting or smelling on?
Love it.
You like it? Good. Excellent. Anybody else? What do you taste? What do you smell?
The cider. Like the whiskey or the corn.
The corn beer. What's that?
We've already moved on.
We've already moved on. For me personally, it reminded me of like white wine with a piece of cornbread floating in it. That's what I thought. It's like if I had a Chardonnay with a big piece of cornbread floating in it, that's what it tasted like. That was my impression. What? Rosé.
Like a light flat rosé.
Like a light flat rosé. Okay. But yeah, this is a pure corn beer. So, for the modern equivalent, we could not find a pure corn beer anywhere, at least not that we could get on this island. So, we did a little bit of looking around, and we realized in Peru, they have a black corn whiskey. So if you were to take chicha, distill it, and age it in a barrel, you would get this. And all the corn, it's black corn, all raised above 10,000 feet in Peru. And it's a pretty new whiskey. I think they've only been around for about 10 years, so it's pretty new on the market. So this is a Peruvian black corn whiskey. And when I first tasted it, I was expecting it to taste like bourbon. It does not taste like bourbon at all, which is surprising for a pure corn whiskey. So everyone try some and see what you think.
It actually tastes like a Irish.
An Irish.
An Irish, to me, like an Irish.
Anybody else? What are you tasting? What are you smelling? Taste the whiskey. Anybody? The alcohol's 40%. So, yeah, so it's 80 proof. Scotch? Okay. What are you guys getting? It's delicious. Okay. Any other insights or comments?
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Okay. So you love the corn beer and the corn whiskey.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. You're right on track. I love it. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm sure you could probably find a corn beer maybe that someone makes like by hand, but it's really not a soul thing. But the Peruvian whiskey is something you can find. So if you like it and you can go to the mainland, you can probably find it there because it was tough to find. And I think that's pretty much it for the whiskeys, unless anyone has any questions. Huh? So it's about 80 proof, so 40% alcohol. And the beer, the corn beer, was somewhere around like 4.2%. It would have been a lot weaker back in the day because they didn't add sugar, so it probably would have been like 1 or 2% alcohol. That's how they were able to drink 2 gallons a day, because it just really wasn't. But we wanted to like beef it up and make it a little bit more of a modern kind of palate, a little more robust.